Hi, everybody. I'm Susan Hess-Loge. Mitch Schultz is not going to be joining us today, unfortunately, but we have a very special guest, my friend Jasmine Michaels, who's a PhD student at CIIS. And her focus is on reclaiming Aboriginal spirituality in the world's many diverse cultures. So I'll be bringing Jasmine in a minute, but I want a transformational moment in our culture right now. We're dealing with climate change that could cause mass extinction, even wiping out humanity. Then comes COVID-19. And now we have what has been going on for centuries, this systemic racism and social injustice. And so how do we move beyond habits of seeing and being in the world that are keeping us from growing? And how can we feel ourselves as part of a greater whole? And I think of Stan Grof and his many psychedelic experiences, that over the course of his 60-year career, he managed to have these deep experiences and approach them as an explorer, carefully observing everything he encountered so that he could bring back information that he could use to help people. And so we wanted to approach this live stream differently. And we felt that we should start with our conversation, and later we'll get to the interview that I had with Robin Carhart-Harris, whose research shows how psychedelics can change the way the brain functions and open us to new ways of being in the world. But now I'm going to bring on Jasmine Michaels. And I just want to say how happy I am that you could join us today, and how impressed I am with her perspective. And I'm going to give a brief introduction because I don't trust myself to get it all right. But Jasmine is half Nigerian and half Indian. And I'd like you to tell us a little bit more.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really grateful to be here at such an important time in American history, such a time of transformation. So a little bit about me. My father's family is from Nigeria, and we're from the Igbo tribe. And my mother's family is Indian. We're mostly Goan, but also North Indian as well. And in my childhood, I pretty much grew up as a child of a refugee of civil war, because that's what my father was going through. And in that process of being like a refugee's child, you can kind of lose touch with a lot of your culture. So in my teens, I really, wanted to discover who I was. And this was on a spiritual level, and this was also on a cultural level. And what ended up happening as I started diving into Hinduism and into traditional Igbo spirituality, which we call Odinani, as I started diving into these things, I found that there were many more similarities than there were differences. And these similarities really connected with the idea that beyond the differentiation that we see is unity. And that is where psychedelics really come in for me. And that's why they're so important at this time in history. I believe that what we're dealing with in the United States is not just an issue of race, it's an issue of injustice. And it's an issue of separating us based on the idea that some of us deserve more than others. And we are really, the millennials, the Gen Zs, this younger generation that's growing up with the internet, at their fingertips, they're being shown that that's not true. And I believe that our movement inwards through towards inner healing and inner spiritual connection through ritual and psychedelics is going to be a huge part of that movement, because it's by understanding ourselves that we're able to find that unifying thread. And I'm just really excited to be talking about that, because I see it as a huge solution to some of the major issues we're dealing with in the world today.
And in our conversation earlier, Jasmine, you mentioned reclaiming the Aboriginal heart, and that discrimination isn't really against a skin color, that it's really about the Aboriginal or Indigenous roots of people.
Yes. So one of the biggest things that I like to talk about is the fact that Native Americans and Indigenous Americans make up very large percentages of the United States prison system, but you don't ever see them on the news. I have a lot of friends who are Indigenous Canadian, and I can say from experience that the racism that they deal with in Canada is very similar to the racism that I have experienced in the United States. And I started to question, why is it that we don't hear about these people? And what I'm finding is that there is a threat that any major hierarchical system feels to the people who are most connected to the land. Because the truth is always in the land, no matter where you're from. The land can speak for itself. And when you've grown up for, you know, thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years, we really don't even know, with a land, you understand what that land's asking for. So when the indigenous people, you know, are protesting the pipelines, and they're protesting, you know, the building of huge buildings on sacred land in Hawaii, what they're really saying is we're connected to the land. And so I think that for us to be able to move past racism, for us to be able to really be successful in a movement like Black Lives Matter, what we really need to start talking about is, where's our heart? Where's our Aboriginal heart? And I think it's very important because that heart is across cultures. Irish culture, English culture, Romanian culture, you know, Spanish culture, every single culture has a heart that's rooted in the land that they're from. And if we're able to trace our roots back to our land, I believe that we're able to, you know, really have a huge upper hand against all this division, because there's primarily one land, it's the earth, just different parts of it.
And you were even saying that, I hope I'm not giving away personal information, but in one of your psychedelic experiences or medicine journeys, you became aware of the way that the earth holds us during these deep inner journeys.
Exactly. My experiences with psychedelics began after I had a very, very powerful meditation. I practiced a form of Hinduism called Advaita Vedanta. And I was listening to the meditation of my guru at the time, or still my guru, Muji, and I found myself really connected with source. And this was without the use of any psychedelics. It was such a powerful experience that when I came back to my body, I felt like I couldn't relate to people anymore. And this was when I was about 18. And I, you know, went on many different meditation journeys. But the funny thing was, after all of that time, I realized I didn't feel connected to my body, and I didn't feel connected to people or the planet. I felt like I was just floating somewhere. And the first time I took psychedelics, I was in Colombia, and I realized that what I had been missing was the fact that the spirit of the earth had been holding space for me that entire time, and I didn't even know that she was there. All this time that I was meditating, and I thought that I was going out and, you know, I was so cool because I was having these experiences, I wouldn't have been able to do any of that if it wasn't for the spirit of the planet that was creating the space for me. And so I feel as though, you know, in the journey that I was speaking to you about when I came, you know, which was a separate occasion, but coming back and really feeling how much the earth was holding space for us, I think it gives us something that we're missing right now in the world, which is a sense of being nurtured. We live in a world where it's about what you can achieve, how intelligent you are, what degree you have, you know, how much money you make, or, you know, how cool your Vines are, or your TikToks are, or all these different social media things. But it's like the need to be nurtured and know that someone is there for you, no matter whether you're good or bad, no matter what mistakes you are. I haven't really found anything as all loving as the planet. And I think that psychedelics really show us that.
And we were also talking earlier about the importance of being responsible. You know, like, I mean, for instance, in many cases, when you're dealing with psilocybin or ayahuasca, you're using something directly from nature that holds spirit, and to use them without respect, without a ritual to hold them and to honor them as guides, really. You know, then again, there's the white Americans and Europeans that are traveling to South America and Central America, and they're having amazing transformative experiences. But in many cases, they're using up the ayahuasca that the local communities that rely on them for their spiritual practices can no longer find. And you were talking about something about, for people, you had a great suggestion. I'll let you describe it.
So this was one of the biggest, I'll just start with this. My family, my mother's family, my mom, my stepdad, my sister, they live in British Columbia, and they're very close to the Penticton Indian Band. And I remember at a time in my life when I really wanted to know source and I really wanted to know myself, I went to a gathering. And without saying anything, Bruce, who's one of the elders in the community, came up to me and said, "What are you looking for? Because you're obviously looking for something. What do you want?" It was written all over my face that I wanted something from them, and I didn't even know. I had such a lack in myself at that time that I was willing to look anywhere for somebody who would just give me the answer to how I could reconnect. And that's what's happening on a global or on a nationwide level in the United States. We have an entire generation of younger people who are craving connection, but they don't know how to get it. And it's normal to want to go outwards, but it's damaging. It's damaging because we're going outwards to communities that don't have that have not been treated with the respect to be able to take care of themselves the way that they would have if we hadn't kind of messed with their system. So what I think is a really good option, in my personal opinion, is connecting with the Aboriginal roots of our own cultures first and foremost. This doesn't mean that we don't go towards other cultures. I've learned so much from, my friends who are Colombian, my friends from the Penticton Indians. But before doing that, I had to come to a connection with my own culture. And that's not always easy. I think that when we deal with guilt, when we deal with the feelings of having wronged others, when we deal with the feelings of maybe not being good enough, there's a lot of pain when it comes to really embracing who we are. But I don't believe that it's possible to connect with Mother Earth fully if you don't love yourself fully, because you are a reflection of her and she's a reflection of you. So if there's any part of ourselves that we're turning away from, we can only cause hurt. And I just believe that embracing the Aboriginal roots of each of our cultures and doing that extra work to learn about them. I love when people do the ancestry, but they often stop at the big version. So they'll find out they have Spanish ancestry, and then they'll think about the conquistadors and like all of these amazing churches. But what about the Aboriginal Spanish people who lived in Spain? Those are the people who knew and still know the land because they still exist. So that's what I really try to advocate for, reclaiming the Aboriginal heart of your culture, no matter your skin color, because you'll find that Aboriginal people around the world are treated very similarly. No matter what color they are, they're often treated very, very similarly, and it's often not very good. And it's because they tend to advocate for the land before anything else.
And that conversation also helped me to remember that when I learned shamanic journey work from Michael Harner, who is no longer with us in physical form. But anyway, he created the Foundation for Shamanic Studies, and he developed core shamanic practices. He had a PhD in anthropology, and I also think in ethnology. And he traveled a lot through South America and lived with, I don't even want to try to pronounce their names. I'll screw it up. Shibopu, is that, okay? Am I getting that right? And so he participated in their rituals, and he was able to really learn from them, and then traveled the world and from the Siberian shamans and in other countries around the world, learned their use of drumming, etc. But then what he found were many of these cultures had actually lost their history. And the Maya, for example, when they were colonized, everything was wiped out. All of their records, all of their spiritual writings and records were just destroyed because those practices were considered demonic. And so there needs to be also this idea of the idea that we have destabilized cultures around the world through colonization and robbed them of these practices. I think that also needs to be addressed.
And that's one of the biggest things that I struggled with. So the Biafran War, which is what my father was born during, my grandfather was a general in the military in that war, and he was a diplomat prior to that. But he was a general in the military protecting Biafra, which is Igbo land. And the British Army funded that war and supported the Yoruba. And some of my dad's earliest memories are of British planes bombing our village. So growing up with that and knowing that creates this schism where you want to be part of the society, but you also know the pain that's been inflicted on your family, and you're trying to reconcile the two. And what I found is that there are many different motives that human beings are operating by. And when we're insecure, we operate on motives that rely on power and protection and greed. But the higher, what's the right word? The more we connect to our spiritual nature, the more refined our motives are. And something that I've started to understand is psychedelics refine your motives. They change the values that you're operating on, which is part of the reason that I believe that they've been made illegal in the United States. When you take a psychedelic and you really understand what's important in your life, you're not so focused on going and bombing someone from another country because you're focused on elevating yourself. And speaking about lost knowledge, one of the powerful things that I think that quantum physics is really, and you know a lot more about this than I do, Susan, but that quantum physics is really touching on is the way that we view time. Psychedelics, in my experience, allow you to experience time very differently. And as somebody whose grandparents passed away before I was born, psychedelics have really changed that experience for me because I got to meet them during one of my journeys. And, you know, people watching this might be like, what does that really mean? But, you know, for anybody who has taken psychedelics or who has had any contact with any kind of spiritual being, you know that there are levels to connection that really are timeless. And however we want to scientifically quantify that, the point is that I came away from that experience knowing that I had gotten something that I thought I had lost, but it wasn't lost. And I think that that's something that's very important for us right now in the world. We're moving forward very quickly. Modernization and, you know, technology is evolving extremely fast. And in a subtle way, psychedelics slow us down. They give us an opportunity to reach back through time, even into things that might have been burned or colonized or destroyed, because those qualities really are timeless. And the thing about Aboriginal societies are that they exist on a frequency. They don't just exist in time or in a person's body. They exist on a frequency of energy, and that frequency of energy is always there, and we can always tap into it.
Yeah, that's a really important point. We mentioned ritual earlier, and it, you know, I think of in part of the studies, and I don't know if you were in that class with me, but we were learning about the archaic period, and that's when and Steiner would refer to this, Rudolf Steiner, he created biodynamic agriculture and started Waldorf education. Anyway, Rudolf Steiner had said that he looked at periods of human development as cycles and kind of paralleled them with development of a child. And so the archaic period was that moment of total unity with the surrounding environment and with other people in your tribe or community. And that then came this period almost like adolescence, where there's this separation from this unity, and there's a sky god, an exterior out there authority that forces individuation, forces us to see ourselves as individuals. And now we're at a stage of possible maturity. And I say possible because there's work to be done. And that is where we assume that, yes, we are an individual, but we are also part of something greater. And that unity is possible, but now from the perspective of being an individual. And I don't know if Stephen has any images that I sent him. By the way, Stephen is our producer director of the live streams. And he has a question that I'll share in a minute. But anyway, I participated in a march last night in Portland, Oregon, and we have a nasty history of racial injustice. The state wouldn't even allow Black people to own property until recently. Yeah. And, you know, and then we're actually living in a neighborhood that displaced the Black population, and they allowed developers to come in and pushed everybody out, gentrification. So anyway, in the course of this march, I don't know how thousands of people, we were on a bridge at one point. I looked back, I couldn't see the end of the line, and I could see how the bridge got off went down onto another roadway, and I couldn't see the end of that line. And at one point we all stopped and we got to our knees, and you couldn't hear anybody really giving directions, but there was this feeling of being something bigger and not having to think for yourself as an individual, but relying on that collective energy of the moment. And it was absolutely remarkable. And it made me think that this is how we come together as a collective while still being individuals. And that went on for a very long time, but I don't know if you have anything to, maybe the rituals and how important those are.
I think you brought up so many powerful points. I think the first thing is this sort of interplay between being an individual and being part of the community. And I think that, when I think about the way that the earth is evolving and the populations of humans on the earth are evolving, I like to think of a spiral because it seems like it's going backwards, but it's always moving upwards. And I think we're at a time in history where it might feel as though we're going backwards, but we're moving forward. It's just about how we want to move forward and what are the most important values that we're moving forwards with. When I think about the marches that are going on right now, I'm dealing with so many different things because as a Black woman, who's also an immigrant, I'm terrified of the police. I've had a lot of really good experiences with cops in my life, but I've had enough negative ones to rather stay home right now than be out marching. And for me, the guilt that I feel that I'm not there is part of what's been so overwhelming for me. And yesterday I was speaking to one of my closest friends, Kadeem, who's a Jamaican American. He's an artist. And he was telling me that just being yourself is protest enough. Do what you feel safe doing, because just being the way that you are is really the opposite of what was intended for you. And I think it's that interplay between I'm an individual with this experience and this unique feeling, and I have to honor that, but I'm also part of the community. And how do I properly be part of that community with all the baggage and all of the mistakes and stuff that I'm still working through? And one of the reasons that I think psychedelics are important is because they're not about anyone else. They're always about you. Whatever you experience when you're on psychedelics, even if there are other people involved, is about you. If you see something, it's about you. If you have a visual, it's about you. No matter what it is, it's about you. And I think that being part of a community really means being the best version of yourself that you can possibly be. And one of the things that I get concerned about right now in the world is the quickness that we judge others with because we're so dissatisfied with the injustice. And this is on both sides, not to say the issues on both sides, because it's very clear what the problem is, but the tendency to rush to conclusions is on both sides. And I think it comes from a lack of really understanding ourselves. And I really advocate that, anybody who has even a few minutes to themselves in the day should take that time to reflect. And if you have an opportunity to do, a journey in a place in a way that's legal, then I think that's a good opportunity as well. But it's really that step back to finding out what is it that you as an individual are going to be bringing to that community when you feel comfortable joining them. That's what's important.
So while we've been chatting, I got a message from Stephen, a question that he hopes that we would ask. And that is, do you think that it would be helpful if police officers took psychedelics? And I mean, as a form of reconciliation, I don't know if you've heard, I think we might have spoken of Will Keepan and his work with Gender Equity and Reconciliation International, that they've gone to South Africa, that they've brought people together using breath work and listening circles. And that it puts, first of all, it puts people into a non-ordinary state of consciousness in which they have access to these deep feelings that they may not be aware of. And what it also does is it creates a sitter and a breather. So someone is giving their full attention to whoever is breathing, and the breather feels safe and cared for by that individual and supported. And so anyway, do you think that would be helpful?
So I feel like this is kind of a trifold issue. So the first thing is the idea of facilitation. Psychedelics in Aboriginal communities are almost always facilitated. And one thing I've noticed in the West is that facilitation is kind of seen as like needy. If you need someone to watch you, then you're not advanced. And really, that's not really, I think, what it's about. I think that there has to be a level of vulnerability and an understanding that when you're on a psychedelic, you're diving into parts of yourself that no matter how old you are, you might never have seen before. And you might need someone to hold your hand. And I think if we can go into psychedelics from that perspective, that you're placing yourself in a space where it's almost like, like really deep therapy, I think it could be very powerful. The next thing I think that really needs to be talked about is, what is the source of police brutality? A policeman is somebody who feels that they are in a position to enforce moral standards on their community. So policing attracts a certain kind of person in the first place. Not necessarily wrong, but it's a particular kind of person. Maybe they have visions for greater justice, you never know. But the problem is that we live in a for-profit police state where there are for-profit prisons in this country. I know for a fact that I believe in Florida, people work for as little as 40 cents an hour or 30 cents an hour. And it's mandatory. If you decide not to work, they can increase your sentence. So I believe that as long as we have for-profit prisons in the United States, no matter how peaceful a police officer is, he's going to be filling quotas. And, you know, when I look at police officers, I think those are people with families. Those are people with jobs. Those are people trying to follow orders. And there are some really bad apples in there, but there's also a system that benefits off of having them there. And any system that benefits off of brutality will find brutality. You can enlighten an entire wave of police officers, but if the foundations are rotten, you're going to have another layer that comes up. So I think that as a community, during the Black Lives Matter movement and during this movement, you know, first of all, I advocate only for peaceful protesting, without question. I don't like to see any kind of violence against anybody. But, you know, the next thing is I think we need to think about what are the social changes that we really want to see. For me, it would have to begin with prison reform. And it would really have to begin with fixing our relationship between the in and the out group. And that's the third thing. Why do we have this idea that if you're free, you're a good person, and if you're in jail, you're a bad person? Because I think a lot of the time what happens with police officers is that they're trained to believe that if you break the law, you deserve what you get. And I think that the idea of deserving punishment rather than healing is a big part of American culture right now. And that's where the judgment comes in. And I believe that that's really not helpful for us. Do I think cops should take psychedelics? I think if a police officer wants to take a facilitated, you know, psychedelic session in a way that's safe, then I think that would be amazing. But he has to know that he's going back to a system that's not going to support the things that he's learned. And how is he going to integrate that in a way that allows him to be mentally stable? Because it's not as easy as people think. When you really understand that something's wrong and then you go back to that system, you have to be very strong. And I think it's quite difficult. So I think we need really to support the communities of people who want to see justice and to make it as easy for them as possible. And I think we're going to have to work together as a community to make that happen, because we have a lot of things working against us, and it's in a lot of people's benefit for the prison system to remain the way it is.
Well, I know in the state of Oregon, they had the 3 strikes law. I think that happened around the country. A lot of that was tied to keeping, actually, the private prisons in the state of Oregon have contracts with the government that says that they will be maintained, period. So if we don't generate population for their prisons, then the state has to pay for those empty spaces.
And do you know how they find the numbers? They look at kindergarten and first grade dropout rates. So they see how many children aren't doing well in school, and that's how they know how many cells to build. And I think it's important to remember, this isn't some big conspiracy theory. We are designing our communities actively. Every time we step outside, every time we take the trash to the curb, every time we, you know, pick up the mail, we're taking part in a social design that we're all part of. And the beautiful thing about movements like this is it reminds us that we have the opportunity to redesign. You don't have to burn everything to the ground. You can redesign with the tools that you have. And, you know, I think that there's a huge opportunity for us to redesign our prison system. We can protect our communities without needing to demonize each other and to, you know, potentially create further destruction by increasing rates of poverty, which is what mass incarceration does.
Well, yeah, it takes the fathers away from families for the most part. And well, the one thing I find so interesting is I forget what country, is it Denmark or Sweden, where in the prisons they get psychological support, they get education, they get healthcare, and it's seen as an opportunity to heal somebody so that when they come out, they can be a productive member of society. And I know Mitch, who wasn't able to join us today, mentioned the documentary, The 13th. I haven't seen it, but my son mentioned it to me. And I believe Ava DuVernay is the director of that. And it talks about the 13th Amendment, which was created specifically as a way of handling, you know, I think it was after slavery was abolished. It was a way of keeping people of color from real freedom.
In the 13th Amendment, where it says specifically that, you can't be forced to work unless you're in prison, unless you've committed a crime. So I think that, I think one of the things that people right now are dealing with is this feeling of being so overwhelmed by the levels of injustice, like with what we're talking about right now. It starts with psychedelics, and then it goes into Black Lives Matter, and then suddenly we're just like down this rabbit hole, because the reality is that the injustice is really quite deeply rooted in the country. But I think another thing to remember is that anything that can be written, you can unwrite. Any law that you can pass, you can reverse it. The reality is, the reason that the system is this way is because in some way we are all playing a part in it. My fear plays a part in it just as much as the aggression plays a part in it. And I think that, us reclaiming our individual power, even before we leave our houses and even before we share that power with our neighbors or with somebody else, is the number one way that we're going to make the change that we want to make. Because it's like this, it's like right now, it's almost like we live in a country where there's a bunch of little angry, bees, and they could be stinging. But the second they're not angry, they could be making honey. They're the same bees. It's the same bee. It could be stinging you or making something. And I think that we all have a responsibility to decide what type of energy we're bringing to the situation, which is where I believe psychedelics are really important.
And so getting back to, just the power of non-ordinary states of consciousness, and I don't know if Matt wants to jump on. We were talking the other day about, there's Matt Zian. He handles our social media. And
everyone.
we were just talking about some ideas of how we could be more responsible when we do decide to have a psychedelic experience. And Matt, I'm going to let you share some of the ideas that you thought of.
Absolutely. I've been, mentored very well. Mitch Schultz being one of the great mentors around how to do psychedelics with respect and really in a ceremonial fashion. And I think one of the things that really stuck out from all the experiences I've learned is the more that you put in, the more you get out. So instead of just kind of willy-nilly taking a psychedelic and deciding kind of the day of, instead for a week or maybe even plan out your journey, what day it will be and what steps you will take prior to cleanse the body, to cleanse the mind, to kind of move your energy into a heightened state already. When you do take the psychedelic, it can amplify your already heightened state, and some things we talked about was not eating meat maybe the week before. You can go vegan. You can practice cleansing the body through sauna or exercise or just daily meditation. That's kind of more for the mind, but kind of building up your energy before you go there so that when you land in the space that psychedelics offer, you actually have put in a lot of work into achieving the state, and that the rewards or the experience might be even more powerful that you receive from that. And I think that actually does tie into, Jasmine, what you've been talking about, ritual. So how can we explore the idea of creating ritual in daily life, and especially using psychedelics as change-making tools to achieve a unity understanding, the understanding that we are all one and really we're the same thing. And, I would just like to open the floor to how to bring ritual into daily life and use psychedelics as tools towards unity.
And you also mentioned, Matt, the idea of journaling, the idea of when I learned shamanic journey work, you set an intention, and Michael Harner would say, the strength of your intention will determine the success of your journey. And I've tried setting intention for psychedelic experiences, and I very rarely get what I asked for, or I understand later that my idea of what I thought I was looking for wasn't what I really needed. And so I've now just say, show me what I need to see, or let this be of service to the greater good. But the idea of journaling before and after, just to try to remember
Yeah.
those things are. You were saying how helpful that was for you.
Yes, writing intentions out, things that you would like to address, maybe just the fact of writing your intention out, they say that words are kind of like spells or like spelling, right? It's kind of like the idea of spelling things out is putting it into existence in a way that the universe, maybe through law of attraction, that's just my angle. I know a lot of people don't agree with law of attraction, but could bring that into your sphere, you know what I mean? And then also with integration, which I think is the most important part of the psychedelic experience, how writing what you've learned and how you want to change and the things maybe that you're gonna do differently can help you remember those things and push them forward in your life, instead of having that aha moment, but then kind of 3 days later you've kind of forgotten and you're back in your normal daily habits. So again, I think ritual and coming back to these journaling things could even be a type of ritual, like, hey, I want to read my journal again from that powerful experience I had, that type of thing. So I just want to open the floor to discuss that.
I love, you brought up so many amazing comments. And I think that one of the main things that I kept thinking was how law of attraction is really about unity beyond the human and into everything. So I feel like I love the idea of law of attraction. And what it means to me is that when I want something, I'm not just communicating with my body or the person next to me. I'm communicating with this entire sphere of energy. Just like if there was a cell or, a part of my body that needed something, whether it was, oxygen or blood, my brain would send that to it because we're part of it's one unit. I feel the same way about the universe and the way the universe operates. And I think when you're talking about, cleansing and preparing your body, my most powerful experiences were after a 1 week juice cleanse. I did a 1 week juice cleanse before I took anything, and it was a much cleaner and clearer experience. And I think that, what I hear from everything that you said, Matt, was almost like a sense of respect. And I think it's a sense of respecting what that plant is offering you. One of the issues with seeing plants as non-conscious beings is that it makes it very easy to forget that they're giving you something. And the least you can give in return is an equal amount of effort and care to your own process. Because when you take a psychedelic, that's the spirit of that plant is investing in you. It's investing its energy and its body into your spiritual growth. And if you're not investing the same amount, you will feel that. You'll feel that lack. So I think that some really simple and really practical ways are to have art supplies around, to clean your house or clean whatever space you're going to be in, to make sure that the people that you're around are people who you trust and people who trust you, to have very clear boundaries about what kind of activity you're going to be doing and what activity you're not going to be doing, not to mix things together. Taking a psychedelic should not include alcohol or tobacco, in my personal opinion, unless the tobacco is being used as an offering, and just little things like that. How would you go to church? What attitude would you bring if you were going to meet the Pope? That's some attitude that you should bring to going into a sacred space, because you don't know what energy you're going to be meeting. And really that energy is coming to meet you based on where you are.
Absolutely. I totally agree with the cleaning note that you'd said. It's fun how I definitely have created that ritual of cleaning the space, cleaning the house, making sure everything is on point, so that when you land in there, you're like, oh, I really love my house. And it's so nice that I took the effort, what I mean? It's such a small thing, but it really pays off in dividends. And especially with the diet thing too, I feel like, with doing things like water fasts or juice fasts, like you said, or even just eating much lighter, like say you're someone who eats a lot of carbs and a lot of meat on a daily basis, a few days of not doing that, you will feel lighter and different. And your digestion will thank you as well. And there's a lot kind of like less energy needing to go towards digesting, so that maybe that opens a little bit up for your brain power to have a little more juice as well, to explore those realms and those states. So I love that. Yeah.
Well, I think we're probably towards the end of our time together. And Jasmine, is there anything else you might like to say? Because I really have appreciated your comments today. I think it adds a really valuable perspective. And, Matt, is there anything else you want to ask, or are there any other questions that have come up?
I'd say the one thing that we could explore just for another few minutes is the idea of not overdosing, so to speak. Remember, because we did discuss that sometimes people want to kind of be a little reckless with the dosing that they might take. You might not need as much, and in fact, if you go too far, you might actually retain less. So I just wanted to, we've all, had psychedelic experiences here. How can we be as responsible as possible with our setting and dosage as well, and use, pretty much use the information that you gain from these experiences in the best way possible to help our communities and ourself, be the best version that we can be.
Personally, I would say that seeing psychedelics as a medicine rather than an experience is the first way. If your psychiatrist gave you a medication, you're not going to be like, I think I'll take 3 of these because it might be extra fun. No, start with the minimum dose. Start with the minimum dose because you're taking a medicine. It's a medicine from the earth, but it really is medicine. And then I also think that the word reckless is really interesting because it is a kind of recklessness, and I think it comes from a yearning. I think people's risky behavior usually comes from desperation. And I would say that if the person notices that they really always gravitate towards taking more than they need, it would be an indication that they might feel that they're missing something. And maybe that's something that they might want to look into a little bit in maybe one of their experiences. Because a lot of the time, the things that we do that we don't like about ourselves are coming from something that we feel like we're missing. So developing that relationship with our intuition, trying to open up those channels of communication. As you said, meditation is like a form of cleansing for your mind. And starting to open up those channels before we even go into a situation makes it a lot clearer to know whether you're going too far. But that has to come from you, I think.
Awesome. I love it.
No, that's excellent. And, Stan would say, the higher the dose, generally the darker the journey. And sometimes what comes up without help, without a sitter, without a facilitator, that information can be more than an individual can process. And so there is a risk that the experience will be more than you bargained for. And you won't have the support you need to get you through the integration of the information. So that's the other reason. But anyway, so I want to thank Jasmine, and I want to thank Matt and Stephen. I'm sorry that Mitch wasn't able to join us today. This has just been wonderful. And now we're going to stream this interview with Robin Carhart-Harris. And so Robin is the director of the Center for Psychedelic Research at Imperial College in London. And they are funded by the Beckley Foundation. I hope I'm getting that right. And what they have discovered in their research is this way that the brain functions. It's hierarchical, and meaning that there's a structure that limits what information is available. And when someone takes a psychedelic, all the neural pathways are open simultaneously. And so suddenly there's information. And this, Robin has a different, I won't say what he thinks, you'll have to watch his interview, but what they have found is that untreatable depression, addictions, compulsive behaviors like anorexia and things like that were suddenly able to be moved past or moved beyond, because during that period of a psychedelic experience, information was available. And then afterwards, of course, the brain reestablishes its way of preference, but that information is retained. And so people are able to change. And it's a really very important information. And I highly recommend people watch this interview. So thank you, Jasmine. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Stephen, who we can't see. And many thanks to Robin Carhart-Harris, who is on paternity leave. He just became a parent. So anyway, thanks, everybody.
It's fair to say, I think, that I wouldn't be doing the research that I'm doing had it not have been for reading Stan's one of Stan's books, Realms of the Human Unconscious, and I was studying psychoanalysis at the time, and was kind of ambivalent with the topic, and felt on some level that it, there was truth there, and that the mind does indeed, run deeper than ordinarily we're aware of, but was frustrated with psychoanalysis, and it felt like this kind of cliquey space for kind of excessive intellectualism and sort of beard stroking. And I just wanted, in a kind of impatient way, I wanted to know, is it real, is it true? Because I feel it is, but if all we've got is dream interpretation and such like, free association, which isn't really dealing with an altered states of consciousness, then this isn't really ever going to go anywhere. As in, in terms of the future and really impinging on mainstream science. And so the thought that a drug might do something was intriguing to me, and I didn't quite know what at first, and I was thinking of things like alcohol. When you're drunk, you become disinhibited. Maybe aspects of psyche that are ordinarily repressed become emergent, but then alcohol is a sloppy drug, and I felt that maybe there was something else, and then I did a library search, and the search terms that went in were LSD, unconscious mind, and there was Stan's book, and that was just it was kind of spine tingling. It was this. Here it is. And then I went to the library and they had a copy, which, thinking back, it wasn't the greatest library in the world, Brunel University, and it wasn't really a psychology institution, but they were running this master's in psychoanalysis that I was doing. But there it was, and I got it out, and I'm a terrible vandal of books. All my books I scribble in, even library books. It's pathological, really. But it was a pencil, but I was all over it, and I read it. I think I read it in a day. That day that I got it, just stayed up reading, so immersed, so excited. I think I looked for Stan's email on the internet and fired off a ridiculous email about, this is it, this is evidence for core psychoanalytic concepts, very naive to the fact that that's what he's saying. It's not my idea. I'm reading it, it's his idea. It's a kind of egocentrism of youth, perhaps. I was, in my early 20s. I was just blown away. And then after that, I knew that that's what I wanted to do. And I suppose for me, I have always valued brain. And for me, it felt like a logical progression. Where next with this? Wouldn't it be interesting and maybe important to know what all these mechanics are on the level of biology, and this aspect of nature, which in a sense is of equal importance, certainly worth knowing, I think. And I thought that would add to the compelling nature of what's being said if we knew the mechanics. So the next move for me was to try and pursue doing a PhD in psychedelic research, and in some ways that is how things went. I didn't quite get to do what I wanted to do straight away, but who does, But I wanted to do a brain imaging study with LSD, and I thought, Freud set of dreams. They're a window in on the unconscious, a raw road. And this is what Stan's saying about the LSD experience. It would be an interesting kind of triangulation if, when you look in the brain during dreaming, you see a similar thing to what you see in the brain during an LSD experience. And so if the psychologies are overlapping in some way, and the biologies are as well, then we're starting to firm the ground. So that's what I wanted to do. And I went to a chap called David Nutt in Bristol, and shared the idea. He basically said, you can't do that. And he said, you know, there's a guy in Zurich called Franz Wallenbeider, why don't you write to him? And I think I said, oh, I have, and I'm putting all my eggs in this basket. I kind of put the sort of pressure on David, and he said, well, we're interested in serotonin, how that works in the brain. We know that MDMA interacts with the serotonin system. Why don't you study the serotonin system, do sleep recordings, which sleep being very sensitive to serotonin changes, and kind of cut your teeth in basic psychopharmacology and then see what happens, you know. So that's what I did, and it led on to what I do today. Mm-hmm. Meditation, certain meditative states, the non-dual awareness meditation seems to collapse the difference between certain systems that are kind of fundamentally different. They're fundamental systems, one for looking inwards, one for looking outwards, and the difference between them collapses, and they work more like a coherent global system. And you see that with non-dual awareness, and it kind of makes sense, you know, a unitive experience, non-duality. You would have a more unified, globally unified system, the brain and mind. And psychedelics, the unitive experience, the very essence really of the spiritual experience, that sense of oneness and connectedness. So that's really intriguing that there's overlap there. The issue with meditation is that it's unreliable. You know, there's plenty of people, if you go to a meditation class, a meditation group, who say, I just can't do it. I can't get out of my head. And you can see that they're really frustrated with this, and it becomes part of them. You know, as soon as they sit down, they've told themselves, I can't meditate, you know. And you're just thinking, oh, just a pinch of psychedelic, you know. That's the answer. That's what. Then you'll know. But it is an issue, and that's why meditation's really useful as a space to help kind of normalize the psychedelic state and communicate to people what the psychedelic state is and how you might get there. But it's also less potent, you know, or at least it is for most people, and it requires a lot of work and effort, really, in most people to achieve anything akin to what can be achieved with a psychedelic. For a long time, I've been compelled by a particular model of how the mind and the brain works. Another key figure, I suppose, in my academic pathway, guy called Carl Friston, a British neuroscientist, has been quite an inspiration, and his model that he's pioneered, of course with others, you know, nothing's ever entirely new, but he's been a very important figure, is referred to in various ways, but one of them is hierarchical predictive coding or processing. And it's a model of the mind and brain that tells us that, or suggests that, first of all, the brain is organized hierarchically. I mean, we know that from a number of different ways of looking at brain organization, but also intuitively and empirically, so is the mind. And as you move up the hierarchy, you're moving up in abstraction, really. But as you move up, you're also seeing systems that have a domineering influence, but part of the quality of that influence is around suppression. That these representations of stuff, world, self, are very reduced, very broad brush, and so a lot of information below, or I suppose potential information, is lost with that kind of brushing over of content, really. And you know, the self, the ego, is a classic example of a broad brush model. This is who I am, you know. I tell this story to myself and to others, and others reinforce the story. This is what you're like, this is who you are. And yet there's so much more, not just within our lived experience, which of course is rich, but through our ancestry. And all of that is lost unless you break down these compressive systems at the top of the hierarchy. And it seems, at least theoretically, in a number of different indirect, some direct evidences suggest that this is what happens with psychedelics, that these high-level systems break down. And by implication, that's going to mean that the hierarchy breaks down, because in order to have hierarchy, you have to have something above, which is oppressing, really, what's below. Oppressing, suppressing, repressing, it's all kind of related, really. And then by implication, that means that the systems below are going to find freer expression. And the systems above them, or at least previously above them, are going to be sensitive to that information. The information is going to impress on those higher level systems and be felt and experienced and known. And in many ways, that's the very essence of a psychedelic mind manifesting experience. It's this wow, that there's much more to the mind than ordinarily you were aware of. And you know, it's truly mind-blowing in so many senses, that realization that the mind runs so deep, and then it's so compelling that you kind of, you know, want the world to know, really. And that's what I saw in Stan's work, and that desire to inform the world that the mind runs so much deeper than most people realize. And it's such an important, essential message for people to hear and acknowledge, when otherwise they're wandering the streets literally like zombies, you know. And it's kind of tragic, you know, and without being conscious of it, hurting themselves, hurting other people through that unconsciousness, hurting the planet. So, you know, it's a kind of tragedy of the human condition, but one that isn't necessarily inevitable and, you know, acceptable. Yeah. I mean, it's quite telling that the drugs that dominate at least Western culture are drugs that dull, you know, and dull the psyche, whether it's alcohol or opiates, you know, pain relief, or SSRIs. And if you talk to people who actually take them, you know, let's forget about the psychiatrist for a second. You talk to people who take them, they often say, there's often a term that they use, and it's that I was like a zombie. Actually, a colleague of mine, a psychiatrist, who said that I had to live 2 years to get a year with the SSRI, in terms of richness of life experience was depleted. And this is a psychiatrist who knows, you know, neurobiology really well, actually. He knows serotonin science, And he made that statement, and I thought, yeah, that's kind of remarkable. And you know, and that's what's sort of accepted and almost sort of celebrated or promoted by the system that we live in. And psychedelics are such an affront to that, because they are working in a different direction. Instead of dulling the mind, expressing the mind. And it's really through that awareness that you have while you're under the experience of a psychedelic that is then influential in a kind of residual way afterwards, that accounts for how they can change people, often in a positive way. There's all sorts of different factors going on, I suppose, when the psyche is breaking down in a really fundamental way, breaking down but also opening up, that content can spill out, which is just remarkable in terms of, you know, how kind of like grotesque and frightening it can be. But, you know, why through our imagination, I'm talking about humans in general, can we produce works of art that depict demonic scenes and the very notion of hell, if it's not there in our psyche on some level, and it's just being called up like as a sort of faint whisper often that there's something there, you know, because it resonates when you express this stuff and people feel it, like horror movies, you know. Why do they register at all if they don't register and resonate? And I suppose with psychedelics, at higher doses, all of that can spill out, and it can be terrifying, but it is of the mind, and it's better to know, I think it's healthier to know that the devil is something within our psyches and within our souls as humans, rather than some, you know, object out there that is to be feared and you know, denounced and as if, you know, the devil's not part of me, it's out there. It's much healthier to understand all of this as of the human condition. There is a difference. There's a similarity in the sense of, you take a system that's malfunctioned, you know, like in a deep depression, and you shock it, you know, and you create this storm, and then afterwards, as the system recalibrates, it can recalibrate in a healthier way, be knocked out of its depression, and there can be a kind of calm after the storm. And that model works, and it works for ECT. It helps kind of explain in an analogous way, but not entirely just analogy, also in terms of what we know about the mechanics. It makes sense of ECT, and to some extent it makes sense of the psychedelic experience. Of course, it's a very depleted representation of the psychedelic mind manifesting experience, because the process of kind of scrambling isn't pure chaos, you know. In all chaos there is cosmos. In all disorder a secret order, was Jung, and there you see it, because the mind is conscious during a psychedelic experience, and the breakdown of the mind, at least the ordinary organization of the mind, is experienced. You know, you're not knocked out with an anesthetic like you are with ECT, and so it's watched. You know, the mind's revealing itself, to borrow from David Lynch. And that's the really remarkable thing about the psychedelic experience, more so than dreaming, because dreaming is sort of immersed in it, and it's what's been referred to as a world analog. You know, you're living the experience as if it's waking consciousness. You're not aware that you're dreaming usually. But under a psychedelic, you know, you're kind of watching this, and most of the time, you know that you've taken a psychedelic, and you can just watch, you know, the theatre of the mind playing out, and So that's a big difference with ECT, and yeah, it has to do with a few things, I think, that although the mind is altered in quite a dramatic way under a psychedelic, it's not going in a direction of a sedation or a sleep. You're wide awake, and you look at the electrical activity in the brain, and it looks like a very awake brain. You know, I've used this term. It's not just a concept; it's a measure of entropy to talk to this, and really, that's a very simple measure of how random, really, the brain oscillations are over time. And so if you look at an EEG, you know, those caps that you can put on people's heads and read electrical activity, then the activity is really chaotic and hard to predict, really random, and that's what entropy is. It's the difficulty to predict something in the future because it's so disordered and random. And that's what you see under a psychedelic, and that's representative of an awake brain, kind of like a super awake brain, really. If you look at a sleeping brain, the activity becomes slower and more predictable and kind of boring, and you know, and you lose consciousness when you fall asleep. You go into dream sleep, REM sleep, and the activity enriches again. So it's a really neat principle for mapping between brain and mind. Of course, there's much more to the picture than just, you know, the richness of the electrical activity mapping onto the richness of subjective experience, but it's quite a useful rule. If you were to shock someone with ECT, you would generally, I think, also be inducing a degree of regularity in the storm, I suppose. Whereas the psychedelic scrambling is sort of more of a natural, sort of spontaneous chaos in a way, where there's order and not just pure disorder. Although 5-methoxy-DMT might be an exception to that one.
Really?
Well, we don't know because we haven't done those recordings yet, but phenomenologically, in terms of subjective experience, people describe it as a whiteout, you know, often, that they're conscious, but are they conscious? You know, they're conscious, but there's no content, which is really difficult to fathom without having experienced it. Yeah, it's a bit of an enigma, and it divides people a little bit. You know, are you seeing the world as it really is on a psychedelic, information that is ordinarily kept from consciousness? Well, I subscribe to the view that you are, but you're seeing the inner world to a larger extent. I think, yes, to an extent, you know, you can see things in the external world with greater granularity, but a lot of what's being imposed with eyes open on the sensorium under a psychedelic is mind. It's kind of projection from what's housed in the mind, and that's spilling into perception. So you might see an archetypal being in the darkness on ayahuasca or something, but in my view, you're not actually seeing as a spirit or something out there in the world. You're seeing spirit that's housed in your mind and has a reality in psychology and human experience, to put a bit more of a sort of human coloration on it. Yeah. And so that phrase of the mind revealing itself to itself is quite a nice one, I think, because this is what's really exciting, I think, about psychedelics, is that it's a revelation about inner cosmos, really. Granted, on some level, what's inside and outside is maybe a bit blurrier than we tend to think from the vantage of normal waking consciousness, where we divide stuff up like self and other, But I see it more in that way that, all the richness of content within mind and brain is spilling out and colouring perception on a psychedelic. So for me, that's a better way of understanding it, or a more compelling way to understand it than in some ways you're kind of tuning in, to a spirit world that's out there. I could accept, you're tuning into a spirit world that's there, as in it's there because you experience it, but in terms of, where its primary sort of spatio-temporal location is, in the sense that it's dynamic, so it never has a static location. I would be thinking more about mind and brain for where it's kind of housed, at least. Yeah.
Do you know who Rupert Sheldrake is?
Mm.
Yeah. So I interviewed him, and he was talking about the field theory of the mind. And he describes a metaphor of, well, I don't know if he did in this particular one, but he describes the brain as similar to a TV, that it receives programming but it doesn't generate it. And then he talked about how the brain has an electromagnetic field, that cell phones have a field, that's how they work, that just about everything has a field that is generated by it, or that within which it reacts, or information is shared. And so he was presenting a field theory of the mind to explain what Stan had in the process of his evolution of thought and thesis, was the idea that the brain isn't myelinized in a fetus or a newborn, and therefore the recording of memory isn't possible. But then Stan witnessed over and over and over again that people would relive their time in the womb, birth process, or even past life. And so Rupert's explanation of this was those memories aren't held in the brain. It's not the myelinization of the brain that allows someone to have a memory, that or to be aware of something and hold it, but rather that there's a field that we are drawing from, much like a collective unconscious.
Mm.
So I don't know if you have any thought about that.
Yeah, I do. It's one of skepticism, in the sense that I haven't seen any compelling evidence for that model of things. I know it's fun to entertain an idea like that, but what is that field? When you're presented with a hypothesis like that, really it's incumbent on any scientist to drill down into it and ask questions about it and scrutinize it. And I think when you do, there's a lot of gaps there, So what is this field really? Okay, beyond analogy, that there are fields with electrical devices, or what is it really? How do we measure it? Let's have a good definition of it. I know that's annoying to have that, to be met with that when you're a scientist, but that's the name of the game. Skepticism is the mother of all scientific truth. I think Jung said that actually. That's the basis of science, is asking questions. Yes, sure, we propose ideas, but science is testing those ideas, scrutinizing them. And that, kind of like TV aerial metaphor for mind and brain, to some extent the mind is receptive, but to a larger extent the mind is productive. And I would actually flip the representation that's being offered there on its head and say, actually, it's more the other way, that mind and brain is dominating experience of the world. The handshake is biased on the level of inner models, internal models that are suppressing out information. So the filter thing holds up, in that we close out a lot of information, but to a larger extent what we're closing out really, I think, is inner information that's housed in the mind and the brain. Until I see some evidence that information is in some kind of morphic field out there, then Occam's razor, the most plausible possibility is that it's housed in mind and brain, that are so rich and complex and and information rich, in terms of sheer connectivity, not just on a static level but dynamic level. So that's where I think it's more plausible to look, really. Yeah. Yeah, there's potential there for shift in perspective. One of the challenges with psychedelics is that ego comes back. It's an inevitability. It might die temporarily, and you see things with greater equanimity and perhaps objectivity. But you come down, and what you're left with is a residue of that experience and a knowledge and an awareness. But it's very easy to forget, and then crack on with things. And maybe sometimes there can even be a bit of a rebound where you're like, oh no, I'm not dead. I'm alive. I must live. I must deny death. And I don't know, do something to promote my immortality or that kind of thing. And then you get these curious figures sometimes around psychedelics that are a little bit, messianic and evangelical. Maybe Timothy Leary was a kind of speaking to that kind of archetype, really. And so, sure, there's potential there for a broadening of consciousness and a way of living which is more conscious and aware, but it's not a done deal. So how is it done? And I'm not sure. I'm a bit ambivalent about this view of psychedelics as energizers of a kind of activism. Granted, desperate times, it's not looking good. Let's do something about it. Absolutely. But let's be conscious of ourselves in the process, that we don't sort of overshoot and start creating an enemy, and perhaps be what's the term when you're hating on humans? You don't think much of humans. There's a term for it. Yeah.
Something? No.
It's got anthro in, yeah, misanthropist or something like that.
It could be.
Yeah, so along those lines. Anyway, we're all part of this mess. I flew here, the carbon footprint there. It's not good, and I fly around, yet I'm often thinking, aren't we stupid beings who are messing up the planet? But I'm part of that mess, and so it's a tricky one. And so, perhaps the best we can do is to, certainly not give up, but just watch ourselves in the process and work on cultivating the lessons so that we don't forget them, and that we're watchful of ourselves after having these privileged insights that we can have under psychedelics.
And what is your hope for the research that you're doing? What would you like to see?
Less suffering, really. Yeah. I mean, what's more noble than that as a hope, I think. Yeah, and you see that in the community. These are people often with a brightness in their eyes and an ease, and a kind of joy, which is there. So that's something to be celebrated, and it's reflective of maybe where things can go on a broader scale. So just not to granted suffering is inevitable, but you don't have to necessarily play that suffering game, and stew in it, because to have a life at all, to have a breathing body, is such a privilege. So that's something to be mindful of, I think.